video I will be introducing you to the concept of scales. This is the first of a series of 2 or 3 videos introducing the concept of scales. So the first thing that we need to know is that there are many scales used in the world and many scales used in many different types and styles of music, and that we specifically are going to be limiting ourselves to primarily 2 types of scale. That is the major scale and the minor scale. Now, the minor scale, as we will find in a subsequent video, has a certain number of forms to it, so there is more than one type of minor scale. But the major scale is straightforward. There is one type of major scale, and once we have defined it, it will be the same every time we encounter it. There are, as I say, many other types of scales. There's blues scales, pentatonic scales, there are scales used in Indian music for ragas, there are scales used in Chinese music for traditional Chinese folk tunes and so on. The idea and concept of a scale is a worldwide phenomenon used in many different types of music, and certainly Western music does not have some kind of corner on the market for scales. However, for the purposes of the type of music theory we are trying to understand here, we are going to limit ourselves primarily to the major and the minor scale. In class we may talk about a couple of the other scales, but on the videos it's major and minor scales. So today we're looking at the major scale. So that means the first thing that we need to do is define, well, what is a scale anyway? And a scale is a way of organizing notes within an octave. Now, we already know what an octave is, and if we take the 2 notes of an octave, we can play the different notes that occur between the bottom and top note of an octave in any number of orders. And as we do so, we will create scales. So in the case of Western music, in the case of the type of music that we're looking at, Western art music and rock and pop style music in the Western tradition, the traditional way of splitting up an octave is into, as the name would suggest, is into 8 parts, including the first note you start on and the last note, which is a repetition of the first note. Including those 2 notes, you have 8 notes involved in the scale. So the first thing that we can say about scales, major and minor scales, scales used in the Western tradition, as I say, this is not true of all scales, but in the Western tradition, is that they have 8 notes. The second thing that we can say, so 8 notes. The second thing that we can say is that they use consecutive lines and spaces. That is to say that as you are writing the scale out, you use every line and space between the 8 notes. So let's start, say, here, and as I move up to the note that I will end on, which is an octave higher, I use every line and space in between. And indeed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 notes. I start and end on the same note, and I have 8 notes total using every line and space. So a couple of other things that we can say, right? 8 notes, use every line and space. Third thing we say, you have 8 notes, use every line and space. Third thing we can say about scales is they start and end on the same note. Those are important concepts. Those, in fact, are concepts which are true for major and minor scales. Now, there are different orders of the notes within the octave. We'll get to that in a moment. But these statements are true for all major and minor scales, that there are going to be 8 notes, that they use every line and space when you're writing it out, and they start and end on the same note. Very important that you have those 3 things in place. So here we have a scale. It has all the criteria that suggest that it is a scale for our purposes, for our type of music. It has 8 notes, it uses every line and space, and it starts and ends on exactly the same note, an octave apart, on the same general pitch name, C to C. So let's make some observations about this scale. What essentially is a scale? Well, if we look at the piano keyboard, we begin to see this immediately. Here's the note C, and it leads us to this note C. That's the scale. We're going to divide up that octave, and we're going to divide up that octave by moving up through the various notes that are contained in this octave. But we're going to move through that octave in a particular order. In this particular case, C to C, we're going to move here through 2 half steps, or what we call a whole step, right? 2 half steps creates a whole step. We're going to have a whole step, then we're going to have another whole step to E, then we're going to have a half step to F, then a whole step to G, a whole step to A, a whole step to B, and a half step to C. So if I look at this scale, I could write it out, I could identify that there is a whole step here, a whole step here, that whole step. Apparently I can't write W's. Whole step here, so a whole step here, and then we'll just mark this. This is a half step, makes it easier to see it. It kind of pops out at us a bit more. Whole step, whole step, whole step, and half step. We can say, if we write the note C to C, 8 notes, using every line in space and starting and ending on the same note, this is the order of whole and half steps we have. Now, why did I start on C? Well, I started on C because I'm leading up to something to do with major scales, of course. But I could have started on any note. I could have started on D, I could have started on G or F, and I could have gone on white notes of the piano, and I would have ended up with a different order of whole and half steps, right? Because if I start on F, and I go to F, the white and black notes are going to be in a different order. So there's going to be different places where there's whole notes and different places where there's half notes. The reason I started on C is because this order of whole and half notes gives us the major scale. So, let me say that another way. If you have 2 notes an octave apart, you use every line in space between the 2 notes to write out a series of 8 notes, and you have a half step between the 3rd and 4th and 7th and 8th notes, then you have, in essence, a major scale. All of those things have to fall into place. You have to have 8 notes. You have to use every line in space. You have to start and end on the same note, same pitch name. If you have those 3 things and a half step between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, then you have a major scale. Now, that's great for this particular situation where you're going C to C on white notes of the piano, because it happens to fall really nicely onto the piano with all the white and black notes playing nicely together and working together, and everything seems to fall into place, all right? What happens if we start somewhere else and we indeed find that we don't have this order of whole and half steps? Well, that is where we start to use accidentals, which is a term we have for sharps and flats. We use accidentals, simply another way of saying adding a sharp or adding a flat in order to create this particular order of whole and half steps. Now, you can learn to remember that the major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Certainly you can do that. That is, I think, a little tricky to learn. It's wordy, and it gets particularly difficult to keep it in order in your mind when you're also learning ones for the minor scale, which we'll do down the road. So I think it is smarter, and it makes more sense to learn just where the half steps are. So you learn that in a major scale you have half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Those are where your half steps occur. And if you remember that, then you can create major scales starting on any note, and I'll show you how you do that. Get rid of that one. Let's say to ourselves, okay, we want to write a major scale, we want to start on E. What are the things that we have to have in place for any major scale? Well, we have to have 8 notes. We have to use every line in space, and we have to start and end on the same note. So, using every line in space, I'm going to move up through 8 notes until I get to exactly the same note at the other end. That's my map. That's my basic layout for the scale. Now what I have to do is make sure that I have a half step between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. That's the other part. I need a half step between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. So I start on the note E and I start going up through the scale. And I can do this in my mind, or I can refer to a piano keyboard, whichever way is ultimately best or easiest for you. Today we'll refer to the keyboard. We're going from E to E, and we're going to ascend up through the notes of the piano. As we do so, we are going to see where we have whole and half steps, and we're going to make changes to create the whole and half steps where we want them to be. So between E and F, do we have the whole step that we need? We need a whole step between E and F. Well, no, we don't. E to F is going to create, is naturally a half step. We don't want a half step, we want a whole step. So you always change the note you're going to. So from E to F is not the right distance. We can't change this note, or it won't be E major scale. It will be something else, be E flat major or some other scale if we change that note. So we can't change that note, so we change this note. We have a half step, we want a whole step, so we'll raise this. So E to F sharp, that gives us a whole step. Now, we can then say to ourselves, okay, so from F sharp to G, is that, we need a whole step there, F sharp to G. Well, it would have been a whole step if we hadn't messed with it, but now it's not. So that's fine, we just keep making adjustments. We went E to F sharp, now we need a whole step, we've got a half step, so we go up to G sharp. No problem, we just keep adjusting. Adjust the note you're going to. If you're doing it right, it will eventually fall into place. So let's look at the next one now. G sharp to A. We want a half step there. Well, indeed, G sharp to A. Now that we've made that G sharp, it is the half step we need. So we may have made some adjustments going up, but that's actually helped us out at this point, and it's created a half step exactly where we need one. Now A to B, we need that to be a whole step. Again, remember we went E, F sharp, G sharp, A, now to B. That is a whole step. It is what we need, so we're great, no problem. B to C, we need that to be a whole step, all right? There's no marking here to say it's a half step, so we need a whole step between B and C, and indeed, if we go to B to C, now we find, oh, we've got a half step. So now we need to make it C sharp to create a whole step there. We've done E to F sharp to G sharp to A to B to C sharp. Everything now is working as it should according to our scheme. Whole, whole, half, whole, whole. Let's keep going. C sharp to B. C sharp to B, we need a whole step. C sharp, I'm sorry, I said to B. C sharp to D. C sharp to D, we need a whole step. C sharp to D, that's a half step. We need to make it D sharp. D sharp to E does indeed create a half step exactly as we need it. So D sharp to E completes it. If you have done everything right, the last one should fall into place. If you get to the 7th and 8th scale notes, and you get there and find that that is not the half step you expect, then you've done something wrong down here. You need to go back and check again. Because if you've done everything right, the last one should just fall into place. All right? So that is how you would create a major scale. E to F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, E. That creates a major scale because it has 8 notes, uses every line in space, starts and ends on exactly the same note, pitch-wise, the name of the note, E to E. It has all those criteria, and it has half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. It must be a major scale, E major scale. That's how you do scales. That's how you do major scales. There are a couple of things that I feel I should point out because they are common errors that students make. The first is, it is very common for students to inadvertently end the scale on a different note to the one they started on. Now this does not usually happen when you're starting on a white note, but what happens, for example, if we decide we want to write the scale A flat? If we're not careful, we'll say, okay, 8 notes, using all the lines and spaces. Great, I'm using all the lines and spaces. Fantastic, I'm ready to go. No, you're not ready to go. Because you've started on A flat, but you've ended on A natural. You may be thinking A flat in your head as you write it out. But it is quite likely that by the time you've gone through all the various parts of the scale, making sure you've got the whole steps and the half steps right, then you'll get to the end and it won't work out. And then you won't be able to understand why it doesn't work out. You'll start coming back. And the whole problem is simply that this is an A flat. If you start on A flat, you end on A flat. Now, I may say that and you may go, well, duh, yeah, of course. I understand it seems obvious here, but you'd be amazed at how often people forget to write the last note exactly the same as the first note in terms of pitch name. That is important. And because now, if you have your half steps in the right place and you put in all the various accidentals that are necessary, you will create an A flat major scale. If you do not have that last A flat in place, very easy to get yourself messed up and then feel like you don't understand it, when in fact you probably do. You just miss this one point. So that's certainly one thing to bear in mind. Another thing to bear in mind is that you have to stay consistent with the 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. So there will be some major scales that when you start out doing them, you may get to the top end of it and you may find you have to use a double sharp to make it work. And that is perfectly fine. There will be scales where double sharps may have to be employed to make it work out. And it would be tempting to write 2 notes on the same line or something to try and avoid that. And that is why it is also important to use every line in space. If you follow these 3 criteria, 8 notes, use every line in space, start and end on exactly the same pitch name, and you have half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, you will have a major scale. But you break any of these, and your major scale will fall apart. So those are the things to bear in mind. What you need to do now is to start from a whole variety of different starting notes. Any one of the given pitches, start on some of the black notes. F sharp is a great one to do. E flat, write out some scales that follow these criteria, that have 8 notes, use every line in space, start and end on exactly the same pitch name, and that have half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Do that and you'll be in good shape with major scales. What we're going to look at in the next video is minor scales and the different types of minor scale. Thank you.